Welcome folks, today we're going to be looking at some really basic intro to optimizing inside of Notch. For this example, what I've done is I've loaded up the interactive balls samples that comes with the interactive pack in Notch's website, which is a really great pack because it has lots of little fun stuff that you can play with and learn from, and it comes with a pretty visually great looking project, but that happens to run a little bit slow on my laptop. So we can play around with this. Let's take a quick little stock of where our performance is at right now. If we look at the bottom, my FPS can't even hold 30 right now. You know, we're hovering around that 25, 23, 25 FPS mark. We can see my GPU says 38.3 milliseconds. My CPU says 24 milliseconds. What do those mean? We'll get to that in a second. But first things first, I always recommend capping the FPS of your projects. Unless you're doing some offline rendering, most of the time you're going to be integrating these into some other systems, and you're really going to know what FPS you're going to be working at. You know, is the project going to be run at 30 FPS, 60 FPS, 120, whatever it is, I like to cap it. So I'll come down to the P down here, set my max FPS to be 60 in this case. That's what we're going to try and get to with our optimization here. And then what I'm going to do is open up the profiler in the bottom right over here. Now, if you've never opened up the profiler, don't worry, we're going to look at it in pretty good amounts of depth. And before we even turn it on, we have to really become comfortable with these target numbers we're trying to reach. And what is a millisecond versus an FPS? You know, a good way to think about it is that FPS is a target that you're trying to get to. You know, we're trying to get to 30 frames a second of output. We're trying to get to 60 frames a second of output. And the amount of time it takes the computer to render each one of those frames, that's what these millisecond timers are. And a good, two pairs of numbers that you have to memorize forever, if you're trying to hit 30 FPS, 33 milliseconds. Both of your GPU and your CPU timers have to be under 33 milliseconds, because that means your computer can generate frames fast enough to hit the target of 30 FPS. Now, if you're going for 60 FPS, that magic number is 16.6 milliseconds. So that means your GPU time has to be under 16 milliseconds, your CPU time has to be under 16 milliseconds, and then you'll be able to generate frames fast enough to hit that 60 FPS target. Now, as we start to go through this, we can already see that these are quite a ways away from 16 milliseconds, but we're gonna go through slowly and optimize this project a bit. So one thing to know about optimization is that it's not some magic art. You know, you don't like click a few secret buttons and all of a sudden the project runs perfectly. It's a process and a balancing act. You know, I always say you're trying to balance CPU usage, GPU usage, usage of your storage, and balancing that against the visual fidelity of your artwork. Because some things we're going to do here, we're going to see today, are going to lessen that visual fidelity a little bit, and we have to make those creative choices, whether those are acceptable losses or whether those are losses that we can't have, and then we got to go elsewhere to find our optimization. So all of this is going to be kind of a balancing act, and I think that makes it a lot more approachable for folks that are just getting into optimization. So let's start our little investigation here. The first thing I'm going to do is open up this little tab here for the frame begin and hit enabled on my profiler. Now, one thing you should know is that when you have the profiler enabled, you're actually going to see that you're going to drop even more frames because the profiler itself takes a little bit of processing power to actually go through every node and figure out, who's taken how much amount of time to do their little processing. So you will see a loss of performance during, but it's always easy to turn it off and get back to your normal state to check against, how much gains have you made. So I'm going to go ahead and enable it, and something I usually do is just drag out the panel quite a bit because I'm going to have two columns that I'm really going to be looking at here. The column on the left is going to describe the process happening inside of Notch, and the column on the right is going to give me two numbers separated by a /. The number on the left is the amount of milliseconds being used on the GPU for that specific process, and the number on the right is going to be the CPU usage. So we can already see here actually that the project itself is quite heavy on the GPU, and you're going to probably find that most of the time when you're working with Notch, because Notch is pretty optimized to work mostly on the GPU. And you can see our CPU numbers are quite low here. So my thought process already is most of the work I'm going to be doing today is just trying to find where I can get some wins on the GPU. And the way I approach optimization is, just like we said, it's not a magic trick. It's usually not a one-shot, done situation. I'm not looking for one place where I can change an option and get 20 milliseconds of GPU time back. I'm going to be looking around to see, can I get 1 millisecond here? Can I get 2 milliseconds here? Can I get 5 milliseconds here? And all of those gains are going to add up and leave you with a good result at the end. So with that said, we can start looking through this from top to bottom to see what is taking up the, most amount of time. And these timers all accumulate from bottom to top to give us this kind of final frame time that we have at the top here. Now, don't worry if you're going through this and you don't really know what some of these things mean. Generate tiles 2D, generate MIPS. I don't know what that means. And we'll talk about a cool little shortcut that you can use to kind of locate where the nodes, which node is actually causing that process. But I always say when you're starting out with optimization, the best thing you can do is try and find places where there's a big number and something that you can actually identify and know a little bit about. So if we started with this process and I can come down here, scroll down, my scene render, that's probably what is actually rendering the whole scene. Seems to have a high amount of digits here. And then I got render, pre-render operations, cloner, generate clones. Okay, so these are starting to ring some bells because, if I go look in the network, I've got a rigid body effector going to a cloner, and that's taking a lot of time. And I've also got a rigid body solver, which is taking quite a bit of time. So let's actually start with the rigid body solver here. I'm going to go over, click on my rigid body solver, and I'm going to start looking at the different properties that I have and thinking about, what might contribute to a lot of processing time. And whether or not you know off the top of your head doesn't really matter, because the nice thing about this process is you don't have to be delicate about it. You can literally just look at the node itself. You can see under it that when I have the profiler turned on, it'll show me the GPU/CPU timers of each. So if I actually can't zoom in on this one, but on other nodes you can see both numbers. So I could just go ahead and start flicking numbers around and seeing if those affect my processing times. So for example, my gravity, brought down my GPU time a little bit, but if I was a kind of artist, I would say that changes the look of my, scene a little too much. So I'll set that back to what it was, which was 13. And then I start looking, floor height probably is not going to affect my processing, dampening maybe, smoothing maybe, update frame rate. Wow, that sounds like something, especially with such a high number like 920, that sounds like something that's going to take a lot of processing time. And my usual workflow with this is I try and find these parameters, these properties, and I just start dropping them until I lose enough visual fidelity or, look and feel of my kind of artwork. Then I maybe step it back up. And at the same time that I'm watching the visual fidelity change, I'm also watching the profiler to see if, as I'm dropping this number, does my rigid body solver actually decrease in the amount of time it's taking. So right now it's taking between, looks like 8 is the average, 8 to 9 for the GPU time. So let's go and try and half this. So I'll just do 920, and I can just say divide by 2. Hasn't dropped it yet. Hasn't really affected anything yet. So let's keep going. Let's half it again. So now I'm at 230, and I'll come in here just to make sure, my scene didn't get messed up by anything. No, it still looks good, still looks good. Hasn't dropped my rigid body solver a ton, so let's just keep dropping it. Let's see what happens. Oh wow, all of a sudden, now that we've gotten down to 115, almost 3 milliseconds, 4 milliseconds of time we've saved there on the GPU. And now again, I'm going to go back in and test it. Is it still doing the things I want it to do? Looks like it, still working. And don't be afraid to kind of push the optimization too far and look for other ways of, for example, what I see right now is the balls are kind of stacking on top of each other more and more. So maybe later what I could do is go and maybe raise the floor or make the balls a little bit bigger. You can always find creative solutions to bring back the visual fidelity or look and feel that you're losing. But the gains that we're making here are already pretty big. So I'm already saving about 4 milliseconds. And let me just keep dropping this. I'll just keep doing it by half until I'm not happy with what I'm actually seeing in the render. And we can see here I dropped it again by another half, so now it's at 57.5. And now instead of 8 milliseconds, this has only taken, average around 2, peaking around 3. So that's a huge savings of time. Now it does change the scene a little bit, like the balls seem to be a little bit more squashed, but these are kind of things that would be an easy fix for me to do later by just changing the size of the balls, changing how they're stacking, the bounding box that they're inside of. Those are things I could easily fix because I still feel that the actual motion of the balls and interacting with them feels quite nice. So then I can say, you know what? I think I've pushed my rigid body solver quite enough. Let's keep looking here. So let's see what we got. We got PBGI generate points. What does that even mean? If you don't know, you can try and take some clues away from the name. So generate points, under it we can see the hierarchy has generate field mesh, voxels, render buffer draw calls, frustum cull instances. And this may be a good example of somewhere where, you know what, I see this thing here, it's taking up some time. What happens if I double click on it? Does it give me anything in a shortcut? It does not. But I know that generating points is usually something related to 3D models. So I can actually go back and say, okay, you know what? I'm going to go find my 3D models here. And we can see I've got a bunch of 3D primitives that are all pretty high subdivision spheres. So I think to myself, you know what would happen if I grabbed all of my 3D primitives? Let's make sure we have a good kind of handle on our time here. We're looking at about 3.5 to 4 milliseconds. What happens if I drop these in half? So I go from 40 subdivisions to 20, and I go from 20 subdivisions to 10. All of a sudden, generate points. Wow, 1.3. And does my scene look different? Does it react differently? Maybe it's not as 100% clear, crystal clear perfection around the edges. But you know what? In many cases, maybe that's actually not a really huge loss. I mean, everything looks good, feels good, the balls still look good, their materials look good. Maybe that's something that I'm willing to exchange for because I just saved another 1 millisecond on my GPU time. And this is kind of the process that I'm talking about. It's not so much about, knowing this dark art of how to optimize. It's about committing yourself to the process of exploring, going through the project and continuing just looking for stuff, changing it, and then just checking, has my visual changed so drastically that I can't make that change? And have I improved the performance of this project? So let's keep going down the list here. What else do we got? I can keep going down. I've got PBGI generate cell offsets. I'm going to come back to this one, but I keep going down. Actually, wow, something that's really expensive seems to be the shadows on my skylight. And if I keep going down here, we can see actually there's more skylight stuff that's taking another millisecond here. Generating my skylight is 2. Wow, so lighting is clearly a big toll right now on my system. So let me zoom in here, head over to the lighting area of my network. And one of the cool things that we haven't talked about, well, actually we did talk about, but we didn't see it in full force, is that under each of the operator node names, we can actually see the GPU and CPU timers right here. And we can actually see, man, skylight and point cache, these are hella expensive. 9 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds on the GPU for the point cache, 6 on the skylight. So even if we had, everything else in this node graph was very low on processing time, these two alone would probably make it very tough for us to run at 60 FPS, at least in their current settings. So now I can go in and I say, you know what, I'm going to restart this process. I'm looking at the skylight. Let me look at some of these properties. And let's pretend that I don't know secretly which property I'm going to change to make this better. I could say, you know what, sky dome radius 40. Let's set it to 20 and see if either of these numbers change. So I'll go ahead, set it to 20. And you know what? Doesn't really affect performance. So I'd go back and set it back to 40. And then you can go down and keep doing this, and number of sample directions. That seems like something that would be related to some processing. Let me try and drop this. Wow, already we dropped down from just over 6 to about 3.8. So that's a pretty big savings. And you know what? The skylight still looks like it's working well. The scene looks good. Maybe I can drop that even further. Let's drop it down to 20. Wow, skylight is now another almost 2 milliseconds drop down to just 2.3. And you know what? The scene still looks pretty good to me. I don't see any huge visual artifacts that would say, oh, you know what, Elburz, we can't do that. It's not going to look good after that. So already saving about 3 or 4 milliseconds on the GPU here. And you can see as we're doing this, you know, this GPU timer, which used to be around 30, is now at about 19. We're not really far away from the 16 target that we need for 60 FPS. Now I can go to the point cache and say, you know what, skylight, maybe it's okay about there. And you know what, actually, we did see a note here about our shadows. So maybe we can actually, we have a shadow map size. Maybe we turn it down a little bit. Try and half that. Not sure if it gave us too much results, but everything seems to be running well, and let's leave that and we'll come back to it. Let's look at our point cache a little bit here. So we got our point cache, and man, this is expensive. And a common thing that's really going to happen once you get out in the real world is sometimes all of your dream processing can't stay in the project. For example, this may be expensive enough that it's like, hey, you know what? Actually, on this hardware that we're using, there's so many other things that we need to generate. We actually just have to delete this point cache. Maybe that's going to affect the skylight, but it just is what it is. Now, let's assume that in this case, we actually do need the point cache. And let's keep that process going. We got point density. That sounds like something that would be related to processing. And in this case, because I know point cache and skylight are kind of working together, I'm going to keep an eye on both of their processing times. So let's go to the point cache. Let's try and drop my point density to 0.4. So, you know, that took a little bit off the top of the point cache, but really actually it took way more off of the skylight than the point cache. You know, we lost another almost millisecond of GPU time here. And, you know, I'm looking through here, making sure that nothing else is popping out at me as like a crazy thing that I should check. But for now, skylight and point cache are where I'm at. And, you know, I'll periodically just test my interactions, make sure they still work, make sure things look good to me. And let's go back. Let's try and drop that point density even further. Let's go to 0.2. You know, we can see our skylights running even faster now. Things are still looking pretty good in the render that I got here. Let's drop it even further. Let's go down to 0.1. Skylight's starting to get really efficient here. And you know what? I think that looks still pretty good. I'm not seeing any crazy glitches happen here, and I'm continuously getting faster and faster. You can see here my GPU is really old. We're about 1 millisecond away from being at 60 FPS. So I can look here and say, okay, well, what about this max number of points in millions? That seems like maybe something we could change. Let's try and set that to 1. Doesn't seem to affect anything, and actually doesn't seem to have affected our visuals either. But let's try and leave that number a little bit lower for now. So we can keep looking here. We can see, okay, well, what about, you know, we got some skylight stuff, environment maps, you know, screen space reflections. That's about a millisecond, you know. And the cool thing, like we mentioned earlier, if you see something like this, trace screen space reflections 0.6, what I can do is double click on it. And if Notch can trace that back to a single node, it'll select that node for you. So now I have the screen space reflections here. I know that's kind of down here a little bit. And I can see, you know what, that is pretty heavy at 1 millisecond on the GPU. So how can I update that a little bit? Well, let's see here. So I've got view angle. I can't see that being too processor intensive, but step size, that's probably going to be something that affects processing, because that tells the GPU how many, you know, increments to jump between sample points. So the higher that is, the less sample points you have across your range. So let's see what happens if I make this double it. So I'll make it 6. Pretty good. You know, we dropped down from 1.2 or 1.3 down to 0.8. And let's keep looking. Let's see, what about our blur samples? You know, blurring, whenever I hear blurring, ding, ding, ding in my head, I know optimization, that's somewhere you can optimize, because blurring is a very expensive thing to do on the GPU. So maybe I'll try and take this down a step. Let's go blur samples 32. You see it dropping a little bit even more. And actually, you know, everything in our render still looks pretty good. So let's try and drop it even further and see. What if we go to 16? Feels good still. And this process, we're not going to go through every single node in this network, but it's really this process, because now what we can see is if I go and disable my profiler here, lo and behold, this project that was barely holding 30 FPS on my laptop is now consistently hovering around 60 FPS, and I'm recording this whole video, live as we're doing this. And look at that. Doesn't that look way smoother, buttery smooth, 60 FPS? Visually still looks fantastic, and we didn't need to use any black magic. So if we're going to wrap up this video, the key takeaways here. Optimization is a process. There's no black magic where you click a button and like everything works way better. You're going to have to go through the network, try different things, experiment with properties that sound like they might be processor intensive, really lean into the tools that you have available, because the profiler here is extremely helpful. For example, if I wanted to go even further, I could re-enable it, look around, and I can see, oh, well, what are these generate tiles 2D? Double click on one, and actually I have some tiles, and I know where those tiles are. Those tiles are down here generating all of the textures for these. So maybe I can find an interesting new creative way of, instead of generating these tiles live, we can see here that it's generating these lines. Maybe I turn it into a movie file or image sequence that I pre-bake, and then I can load that back at a lot higher efficiency than generating it. It's this process that you really want to start to get used to, and the tools like the profiler inside of Notch are really what are going to allow you to take those steps from not knowing anything about optimization and being terribly afraid of it to mastering it and making it a part of your toolkit. Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you're serious about learning Touch Designer and getting into our interactive and immersive industry, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for Touch Designer and interactive professionals. You can click the link in the description to learn more about that. And if you liked this video, hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and click on the little bell icon for more awesome free content.